I got nothing witty to say. Today on the Manspace. Welcome to the Manspace podcast. We're your hosts, Doctors Matt Brown and Rob Porter, and clinical therapist Mike Porter. Welcome, spacemen.
I can already hear the patron saints of the Manspace's response to that statement.
Like,
Rob's going to be quiet today?
Rob, you never have something witty to say. Why do you say it today? Like it's the day you use. I always have something funny to say, and everyone's like, yeah, guy.
You should let other people tell you that.
Yeah, something.
Dude, I
think you're witty, Rob.
Yes. This isn't witty. This is just a fun fact that I learned today. Did you guys know Steve Jobs invented pickleball?
What?
Yeah. No wonder it's so popular. Check it out. So, the story goes that Steve Jobs and his neighbor just invented this kind of in their backyard because they wanted to play games as families. Kind of made it up as they went. And his dog was named Pickles and occasionally would like run in and snag the ball and run off with it. So they named it Pickleball. And then I don't know, like terms like the kitchen. Have you guys ever played pickleball?
Mm-hmm. I know the term.
Read into it.
I don't know where that came from, but I came to know this because my intern was telling me. But I played pickleball officially for the first time last night, and like, just have always called it old people tennis. Either I'm an old person or it is not old people tennis. But dude, it was like high 70s. We were playing outside. Pretty good temperature for Houston, but we were like drenched. And then when I got home, I had to pop some ibuprofen. I almost sent a picture to the guys I played with that said, "I'm old Gandalf," because my knee was like killing me and I had to freaking ice it. But super fun game. So now we have a monthly pickleball game going. But yeah, I just learned this morning. Steve Jobs.
Have you bought your equipment?
No, I was using my friend's.
Expensive.
He got actually some like really good stuff off Amazon for like $20. Like a little bag that has balls in it and 2 paddles. And I told him,
yeah, that's got to be a crazy good deal then.
Yeah, I told him in between this time and next, he needs to like secretly extend our paddles by like an inch or something, and we'll just walk in like we're regulation. But yeah, it was like muscles I haven't used in a long time.
So,
yeah.
Matt, I'm going to poo-poo on your parade here for a second.
Dang it!
Because I was like,
fact check it.
I was told that pickleball was invented in the Seattle area in like the 60s.
Bainbridge
So
Island.
I was just looking this up, and on multiple different sites, it mentions that it was invented in Bainbridge Island, Washington, in '65, with a group of dads, one of which was Joel Pritchard, a U.S. House representative. His dog was named Pickles.
Oh.
But Steve Jobs was not involved in it.
Not Steve Jobs.
He invented a lot of cool crap, but pickleball was not one of those things.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I'm like, dude, how many ways is this guy going to revolutionize the world?
It's like it said it was Pritchard and his friend Bob O'Brien. They built a pickleball court in 1967, and then something about a dog named Pickles. He would often chase the ball and run off with it. Where did it get to the kitchen? Why is it called pickleball? I'd have to read more than we have time.
You just gave me something to say though when I make a bad play. I'm just gonna say Pritchard.
I just Pritchard the crap out of that one. It was Joel Pritchard, U.S. congressman from Washington, Bill Bell, a successful businessman, and then there was one other guy Barney McCullum joined.
Dude, these are some sweet names.
Barney, Bill, and Pritchard.
3 of them, huh? Isn't it a 4-person
Barney
game?
joined later, but it was mostly Bill, Bell, and Joel Pritchard.
And
They were
Pickles.
trying to entertain bored children and tweaked badminton.
So everything about that is accurate except for Steve Jobs. That's interesting. I wonder where he crept in.
Probably
Maybe
someone
that
on
was Siri's
TikTok.
answer.
Someone wanted to make it cooler
Yeah.
than some game from the 60s invented by a rich, fat
I was
white
just
guy.
surprised that my friend Clint Timmerman used to play in like in the 1990s.
Shut up, really?
They used to have. He has pictures of him on Facebook having him and his 3 friends doing a pickleball tournament where they gave each other like stupid looking trophies.
Was that
I was
up
like-
in Washington, though?
Yeah, up in Kirkland.
Well, there you go.
See,
I'm trying to remember where Bainbridge Island is.
isn't it just off of Seattle?
Yeah. So,
In the
early
Puget Hearing?
adopters.
Well, now I have to know that too, because I remember hearing Bainbridge Island 1,000 times. I don't think I ever went. Yeah, it's just one of the like if you went straight out from Seattle, it's Bainbridge Island. Yeah.
Well, there you go. You could scream
Yep.
Pritchard or I pickled my ball on bad
Ew.
plays.
Go tell your intern that you should be like, you better not be feeding stuff like that to your clients because that ain't true. But Steve Jobs was heavily involved in the creation of Pixar. But people knew that already. People didn't know the pickleball
That's
thing
not as
because
cool.
it's not a thing. I love when someone tells a story. It's like, isn't that cool? It's like, actually, that's not true.
You ruined
All
the
right.
moment.
Not only did I not have something witty to say at the beginning, I just poo-pooed on Matt's story.
Man.
You're real down.
You might
Fact
say
checking and
I'm abusing Matt. See, I'm transitioning.
good leaving.
Matt, you have a story for us.
I do. It was
Let her fly. 3, 2, 1. Let her fly. In and out. Lost the game.
so last Saturday,
In the park.
I did close in a suburb of Houston. I did a couple workshops at a women's conference, and it was on seeking relief from anxiety and depression, but I took more like a self-compassion approach to it. Sorry, and I had COVID like over a month ago now, and this is the phase where I clear my throat for like 6 months. Anyway, so I gave the workshop, and this was at a church. So I showed a clip from the show The Chosen, the woman at the well, and so anyway, after it was the same workshop twice. So I had 2 different groups come through, but after the second group, some people came up to just like leave me their email so I could send my slides. And this one person, she hung out kind of while everybody else headed out. And she was like, I need to just tell you that, like, while I know the intent of like your visualization and showing the clip and stuff was meant to like bring good feelings, like I just felt angry the whole time. And so I explored it a bit. And I was like, I mean, she was telling me like, not like you did something wrong, but just, she said, when I watched that clip, it's, for those who don't know that story, the woman at the well is somebody who's had like multiple husbands, and you don't get this much content in the actual biblical story, but like the way The Chosen does it, they elaborate more on what she's been through and stuff. But she said, like, I got really angry because every depiction of a woman who is in sin involves like her sinning with her body, either she's like not dressed modestly or she's committed some sexual sin or something like that. So I was thinking she's maybe talking like about being upset about women being objectified or held to a different standard or things like that. So I'm like, yeah, tell me more. And she's just like, I'm really angry because then she kind of just like shocked me and took this left turn because she's like, because you can talk to a woman all day about, you know, her body and what she's done. And she can very easily say like, well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so. But she's like, but you talk to a woman about her pride and her manipulation and she will bite your head off. And I was like,
Oh.
whoa. It's like, what are you talking about? What are we doing? So I didn't know where she was going, but she's like, you know, my husband and I have had these conversations and basically like, that's my sin. And that's like the hardest thing for me to hear. I'll call him out on it and he'll say things like, I'm a better person because of you, but will you say the same thing to me? And, so it was not at all what I expected her to say. But I also was like, I've had similar experiences like we've talked about before when we might bring up like the many reasons why men don't say what they actually think or feel. And it just seems hard to get at this one. Not with all women, obviously. Like I think when we talk about all, you know, men, we're not talking about all men. We're not talking about all women. It's probably the same percentage of men that do similar things. You know, same percentage of women maybe react this way. But I have had interactions where it's like, if we're talking about anything that might make you look bad in some way, like that is immediately off grounds. And it's usually, I think it usually comes out in like more of a victim narrative than a I'm better than you narrative. And so anyway, that was kind of eye-opening for me because that was the last thing I expected her to say. We talked about it a little bit after that. And just like her point was, and she said that she's had to think about it this way, like, if we truly are equals, then we need to be accountable for the same things. And, but it might be trickier to get into those types of conversations with certain women than others. And I think that men's default stance with stuff like that is to like dominate and belittle and tear down, or like cut and run and, you know, flee the situation. And those are very easily identifiable as like unhealthy, abusive. But the like, you're hurting me, I would never do that, I'm not that way, I can't see myself, is just as unhealthy, but harder like get into a conversation about and like identify. And I think for a lot of guys, they don't realize the massive impact that takes on their well-being. Whereas like, for example, it would be easier, I think, and historically has not been, right? So I think it's maybe newer, and maybe for that reason, there's maybe a feel that emphasis really needs to rest solely on this side of the equation. But being able to say to a woman, like, yeah, the way he's treating you, that's abusive, right? And I think, sadly, I think it's more socially acceptable for a woman to say, yeah, I'm in that role, right? Because a lot of women have been abused. But if you say that to a guy, right? One, I don't think the woman would label it as abuse. Not that the guy in the other situation would either, right? But I think maybe it's harder to like label some of these things as abusive. And I think a lot of guys, for many reasons, will say things like, it doesn't bother me, I can take it. Sometimes I deserve it, sometimes minimizing, all the same things we try to identify in women. But I think it's And I know listeners know I'm saying this, right? I'll just reiterate, like, I am saying if a woman is in that situation, absolutely look at it exactly the way that I'm saying. If a man is in the same situation, what are the barriers for us to like get into that conversation? And as men recognize like this is really unhealthy, and it's like actually tearing down my sense of self, and I'm doubting myself, and she's telling me I'm narcissistic, I'm a horrible person, I'm all these things, and I I don't know what to do with that, and it's like eating me alive, and I'm questioning myself all the time. All the same psychological symptoms that we would identify, maybe, prevalence wise right now, for sure. It's like, yeah, you could say more women go through that than men, but I don't know, just like a lot of things that if we viewed that way, I don't know that it is actually tilted that way, or if it's just guys would never like allow themselves to think of it that way, or if they talked about it that way, they wouldn't get the same response. It would be more like, well, look at yourself, or she's got a point, or I don't know. I mean, I think these are just hard conversations to get into without quickly polarizing, like, and getting into some stupid comparison conversation about like, who's worse, men or women. I'm like, it doesn't matter. I'm talking about the same type of dynamic that both men and women do in different ways, that might be more easily identifiable and easily discussed with a woman in that situation than it is to discuss it with a man. Any thoughts?
I yes, I have thoughts. I mean, the obvious to me is I think when we hear abuse, we still, at least for me, right, and I suspect this to be true for a fair number of people, our mind defaults to physical as opposed to emotional. For starters, because emotional tends to be a bit harder to kind of identify and say, yes, in this instance, that is emotional abuse and that's not. Whereas physical abuse, right, it's a little cleaner in terms of what is and what isn't, although there's certainly blurred lines all over the place. But and so there's still an inherent, because of the physical nature of it, we hear abuse, we think it's a strength thing, which means if I'm getting abused by a woman, then I'm a weak man. Mm-hmm. Right. Which is just kind of, that's to me like the most surface level of why it can be hard for men to kind of look at it and acknowledge it and accept it, is simply because of that inherent kind of, this is how we view it. But I also like something you said about how as men will often be like, well, no, but she's right. I do that. Right.
Do.
And I was talking with someone recently, and this idea, they said the problem is I think I'm right. And essentially I ended up telling them it's kind of problematic that it's right or wrong for you. Like when you approach it that way, that's going to create a problem because it's now something to be won. Right? There's an inherent antagonism in that. There's an inherent conflict in that I'm right, you're wrong relationship. And I encouraged him. I said, no, look at it as a thing trying to be understood. Right? It's not about whether or not you're right. Like, are your emotions valid? And he goes, yeah. And I said, okay, great. Are hers? And he's like, well, yeah. And I was like, okay, then that's it. Like, if you can see how she got where she is, it's about understanding. It's not about right. And so to me, that kind of comes into play here. It's not about whether or not, because again, right, we'll always try to classify right and wrong. And there's a reason, like, yes, I'm not, like, abuse is wrong. Don't misunderstand anything I'm saying there, but in terms of talking about it, it's not about whether or not this thing that you did was wrong and the result was you felt these emotions. The thing is, you feel these emotions, so talk about it. Try to understand your own emotions first, and then try to help the other person understand your emotions. If you shift it away, I think, from the idea of right and wrong, you create more room for that conversation to take place. Because yes, there are some people who are simply kind of abusive by nature, or by choice. But there's also behavior that often goes, and again, this is where classifying it as abusive gets tricky, because pattern doesn't necessarily exist in the example I'm talking about, but often behaviors and comments and things happen, and there's not necessarily a thought about how's this going to be received by that person. We're trying to feel validated in our own emotions and actions, and so we say and we do things to feel that validation. Often that comes by pointing out how someone else has wronged us.
Mm-hmm.
And to someone who hasn't paused to kind of reflect on their own stuff, that conversation of here's how you have wronged me can often come off can often take place in kind of degrading ways. You're such a jerk. You're such a, obviously as you move into a more abusive range, the language gets harder, but that kind of, here's the thing you do for me, or do to me. And this is your fault.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Maybe this is going to veer off of some of what Mike was just saying, or maybe it's not answering the question you asked, Matt. But there's this thought I had in my head about, how come, and maybe I heard this wrong. How come you can call a man on you're being prideful, this, and this, but if you call a woman on it, she's like, how dare you, and don't even speak to that, or whatever, prideful, whatever. And one of the things that I thought about while you were talking about, why is it that we can maybe call a man on this easier than a woman? I think there's an inherent, and again, maybe I'm taking that the wrong way, but this is where my brain went. That's all I'll get at. I think there's an inherent underlying belief when it comes to like morals. And there's a counter argument to this, but that women are generally better than men. All the bad crap that happens in life, it feels like it's usually dudes doing it. We're generally worse people. We're the ones shooting people. We're the ones getting involved in all the crimes, especially all the violent crime. We're the ones who are likely to abandon our kids. Moms don't do that. We're the ones who, whatever, fill in the blank. There's also some misnomers that men are likely to cheat more, which is not necessarily true, or that men are more likely to be actually physically abusive, which is also not necessarily true. But because of that, I think it's interesting. Like sometimes when I've tried to say we bring men often in couples therapy, it's a couple showing up really for a lot of couples unspokenly to change the husband because he's probably the weaker of the two, or he needs the work, or he's the problem. And when I've tried to challenge the woman for her part or her problem, it gets shut down so quickly because it's like, how dare I? She is motivated by higher, greater goods. And so because of that, like his is avoidance or whatever. It's almost like, in Sue Johnson's book, Hold Me Tight, where there's a clear underlying current of if you're a distancer, you're doing this wrong. which is if we borrow the statistical stereotypes of that, it means men, you're doing this wrong. Women are doing it right. It's more okay to be a pursuer than it is to be a distancer. That's the greater good. And so there's this inherent thing that says women are it's almost like we're starting from a place of women are right, probably more right anyway. And so if you call them on that, it's like, how do you have any leverage to call them on that? Men are just worse in general. And I think it makes it, and again, like I said, I actually may have heard this, the way you're describing your story in the totally opposite direction, but this is where my brain went of like, I find it, I get frustrated sometimes feeling like I can often call men on things and they will get defensive. But will also acknowledge like, yes, I did that crap. Like, and then they'll try to say, but here's the other stuff. And when I try to do the same thing to the female, it doesn't work out that way. And then she gets this kind of higher moral ground at which to attack the man in ways that can become very eroding of a sense of self for that dude. That is essentially like, I'm just a human piece of garbage. She's correct. And in ways it's like that I could say, hey, that's abusive, but we don't see it as often because we don't generally see women as abusive. We usually see men as abusive. Women aren't abusive. Anytime you hear about abuse, you don't usually hear about a woman abusing a man or a woman abusing a child even. It's usually a dude doing it, a dad doing it. They got anger problems and whatever. So we overlook that, just like we often will overlook borderline personality in a dude because it's not as normal to see in a dude. You don't see it as often, and it's a little bit, it looks a little different. So it's like with to go back to Jesus times, it's like with women, it's not abusive, it's righteous indignation. They have the moral high ground. So how dare you call somebody on their righteous indignation? It's like, well, because the way you're going about this is totally destroying that dude. You eviscerated him, and then you're wondering why he doesn't want to show back up again. But they don't see it as evisceration. They feel justified in what they're doing. Now, I said all that, and it's possible you're like, Rob, we were talking about back rubs. How the heck did you get there?
No, I think that, sorry, COVID throat.
Yeah, dude, keep it together.
I think that, yes, I've seen all of those dynamics that way. And I guess what I'm wondering too is like, what are the barriers for men in saying like, this is really, really tearing me down, instead of, like a more guarded, kind of, like, whatever, I just put up with it. I just deal with it. I just, whatever, that really, doesn't allow you to get into a conversation about it. And then also if he does, and I guess I should make a distinction here. I think in any situation where you're with somebody who is not, willing or even like desiring to see things differently, their behavior differently, and all you're going to get is kind of like, continually kind of punched in the face if you try and talk about it. That's a hard situation for a man and a woman to be in, if they're on the receiving end of that. And I think as therapists, we don't rush to identify things as like, hey, this person's really not going to change and never going to hear you, and you should probably start stepping back, right? I think we're generally kind of careful to understand the dynamic as a whole and see kind of how it all works before we assume it's like, the person you're with is part of that like 1 to 3% of the population that, is not going to be working with you, right? Like whether it's antisocial personality disorder related stuff or I guess a larger percent of the population in the narcissistic or borderline range where talking to them about this, you're not going to get anywhere. Right. But so if that's kind of its own category, right? How do you help men in that situation identify that, hey, this might be what you're going through and that's why you're feeling what you're feeling? And yeah, we're probably not going to get anywhere if you're talking to your partner. What are the barriers men experience there in like viewing themselves as, in a way, being victimized, right? Without taking on, I think a lot of men would say, I don't want a victim narrative. And I would agree. I don't know that a victim narrative really helps you get to a place of healing, but being honest with yourself about the impact that that's having on you. But this other scenario you're describing is kind of like, what do you do in a scenario where, you know, maybe if a man were to share, what you're doing is like literally tearing at my sense of self-worth, right? And the answer on the other side continues to be, well, you're hurting me worse, or like kind of shaming that he's weak, or labeling him as like reactive because, you know, because of his low self-worth, I can't ever tell you anything because, you know, and I'm talking about guys that struggle to say this. I'm not talking about guys that as soon as somebody says,
Sure. Right.
hey, you're hurting my feelings, they have this massive like overreaction and minimize their partner's concerns and, you know, push their partner's feelings down. I'm talking about guys who struggle to even say, this is really affecting me negatively. And I guess in the second scenario, guys who are working with their partners and willing, you know, there's a willingness to kind of like work towards a relationship versus situations where you might just be meeting with a guy on his own and you're hearing the story and he's kind of like, yeah, but it's not that bad, you know, and you're like, whoa, dude, hold on. Like, let's not minimize this. How is this affecting you? Right. I guess either one of those, but I guess since you're talking more about the when you're working with a couple, right? Like, what are the barriers there?
Well, I mean, I guess I think in some ways, I guess I see it as, I don't think I'd separate those two. I think it's kind of the same. I think the barriers individually or as a couple, like, I think, you know, part of what Mike was saying is correct, that there is a sign of, and Matt, you mentioned this too, there's a sign of weakness that men don't admit well to. We've talked before about Liza Minnelli's boyfriend after her husband, maybe after they divorced, that he's like, she was physically abusive and he got ridiculed into shame and nothing happened to Liza Minnelli. And so there is a social standard that we should be meeting. There's also this interesting element that's like, we don't have, growing up, I think most of us as men heard a couple things consistently. One was, you know, you don't show your emotions or your feelings. So being able to say, hey, this feels abusive to me, or this doesn't feel good to me. I don't think a lot of men even have language for that because they weren't taught that language. Mm-hmm. But secondly, most of us have heard a narrative of like, this is how you treat a woman. You don't do this to a woman. You always treat a woman like this, this, or this. I don't think there's this, I don't know how to say this. I don't think there's a counterbalance to that. I don't think that a women here, I think women hear sometimes like, this is how you please a man, or, you know, like this is your place as a woman, but we don't have this narrative like, you don't treat a man like this. You don't do terrible things to men like this, the same way we do for men. Like we have that narrative so much of like chivalry and this is how you know, all that stuff, but we don't say, and women don't forget that men are very sensitive guys. And so you have to be very careful with their feelings, and we don't hear that stuff. And so that reinforces this narrative that if that's happening, that I feel like I'm being abused, then it's like something's wrong with me, because that doesn't happen.
If I'm letting this affect me, something's wrong with me.
Yeah, something's wrong with me. So like even working individually or as a couple, either way, I feel like part of that is being able to say, hey, wait a second, dude, you feel this. It doesn't, like, if this doesn't feel good to you, if you're losing your sense of self, I've worked with lots of dudes where in a couple or not, where the things their wife has told them or their partner has told them, like I remember working with some where they're like, you know, like, well, I have an anger problem, and I'm like, okay, well, tell me about it. And the story always comes from their wife about this and this. I'm like, well, that doesn't sound like an anger problem. And also, I've never seen you get anywhere remotely near angry. But you seem to have bought into this narrative that like, and then sometimes, you know, like once the relationship ends, they're like, oh, no, that's not a thing for me. But they bought into it because, you know, they defaulted to what their partner or spouse said because they know better than I do. And so sometimes I think it's a matter of saying kind of what Mike is saying too, like, well, what's the emotion that's actually going on for you? Can you just speak up for that? But also having confidence to say, hey, look, man, like, actually avoiding the victim thing. It's not saying you're a victim as much as it's saying, hey, recognize the patterns that are going on here. And when those patterns happen, it does this to people. And so we don't want that happening to you. We don't want you to get into a space where you start to question yourself. So how do you just become aware of what's going on and what it's doing to you rather than saying you're a victim and she's the monster?
Mm-hmm.
Ta-da. Mike?
Well, it's no, like it's funny just thinking about that, right? Like, again, going back to this idea that I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we'll say the average woman, right, doesn't really understand the way that interactions impact her husband. We kind of mentioned last week, and it came up with some clients again, right? And I kind of suggested that for men, probably that what I feel like at least are the two of the more prominent emotions that kind of drive us are fear of failure and like embarrassment. Closely tied with fear of failure would be inadequacy, right? And that's so often, right? Their wife says something and it's like, oh, right, I failed again. Right. And I think that's part of where that narrative comes from for them, is that because they're hearing they did something wrong. So, okay, cool. I failed again. Right. Because tied in with the this is how you treat a woman. We're all taught from the time, right? Like, no, we should protect our families from pain. We should protect, our wife shouldn't feel pain. She certainly shouldn't feel pain as a result of something we've done. And so when she comes to us and tells us that, well, great, I just failed at the job I had. This was the job I had, and I just failed at it. Nobody wants to admit that stuff. Mm-hmm. We don't like to admit when we fail. We don't like to admit when we do things wrong. And you add to that the fact that, we're also never encouraged to talk about it. Right? No one says, hey, what does that feel like for you? Mm-hmm. It's, oh, so you're getting emotional now? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sissy. Right? Or something along those lines where they just don't have reason to talk about it. Or a place to talk about it. But as I've worked with a handful of different women, and, my husband's doing this, and I say, well, have you considered what that's like for him? Right? Have you thought about, like, look, I'm just guessing, but, chances are your husband's thinking or feeling this. And sometimes they'll go ask the husband about it and he'll confirm it. Like, yep, that's pretty much where I live. And sometimes they won't. They'll just kind of keep it in mind as they interact with their husband. And inevitably the response is the same, whether, right, they come back and they're like, yeah, I started seeing it, right? Once I was aware of it and started looking for it, I started seeing it, and it shifted how I interacted. Or I started, I want to shift how I interact because I don't want my husband to feel those things. I don't know. I feel like I've wandered into rambly, but.
You haven't. No, as I'm thinking about all of this too, I think this might seem like a weird left turn, but I think there's like a massive unexplored fear for most men that contributes to a lot of the ways that we handle things like this. And it's like a deep fear of abandonment. Like, if she leaves me, like, there isn't a dude I can think of that's going to be like, hey man, how you doing? Come sleep on my couch. Hey, let me help you. I mean, a lot of guys have that situation where they can go to, but ultimately I'll probably end up alone. I'll probably end up just like without my kids.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah, it's
I
not
think
just
that-
abandoning. It's not just abandoning me alone. It's that like I'll lose everything I have.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that if you were to have a guy share with his friends, right, if he's got him in this situation, like, hey, I'm feeling really beat down, the strategies or suggestions he would get from his friends would probably be shut up, you know, just avoid, maybe just appease, or, some version of just kind of like, well, we all do that. And,
Just
so you
figure out
better
how
just,
to play the game.
yeah, just take it. And, or sometimes guys are like, hey, you don't have to put up with that. And I know a few girls that we can go hang out with tonight, or, hey man, you want to go to the strip club, or, hey, like, like all these things that don't really address the problem. But also don't recognize the problem, right? Like, I think this first thing I said is a result of not doing the second thing, right? Like, if we can't fully recognize, hey man, that's actually really unhealthy.
Yeah.
And yes, in a lot of situations, men and women, really good question. Like, how do you think the other person's feeling? Is this something that's happening between the two of you that is more representative of like a pattern and dynamic? Or are you in a situation where, men or women, like this is, and I think as therapists, I don't know if this has been your experience, but it's like, you can sit there and say, yeah, this is different, right?
Mhm.
I've tried my hardest to see this as a pattern, between two people. I've tried, facilitating some connection between you and the other person, or the other person won't come in. And I've still kind of given them the benefit of the doubt and tried to think, well, hold on, let's understand this. But I think we can say, I don't know if it's felt this way to you guys, but there are certain situations where I'm like, no, I feel pretty confident letting you know, like, this is an abusive situation, and this person is much more interested in controlling you and the situation than they are in changing, and that's a different conversation and a different strategy. So, like, it's probably, in my experience, maybe it's less likely that men will come in under those conditions to therapy, than women. So maybe again, it skews our perception of how frequently this happens. But
Yeah.
but I just think it's like, I feel like I've been well trained and understand well how to help a woman in that situation, and I see and feel confident in some ways helping men in that situation. But I also feel like there's some big blind spots that are really helpful to kind of peel the layers back on and talk about. And I could say, like, and maybe it's just because we're male therapists, maybe female therapists feel differently.
They're wrong.
And as I've talked to, supervisees and things, I think they would say, generally speaking, because I feel like I have more in common with the partner that is of the same sex as me, I feel like I have more to lean on there to challenge them. And so it might be easier for me to say, hey, look at yourself here, right? But I think things like encouraging both people to just be really honest with themselves and see, who do you have the capacity to, like, identify ways that you really are being very unhealthy, and at times maybe really hurting your partner, right? And every time we try and talk about that, it turns back to your pain. And maybe the difference stereotypically is, if you're talking to a man that way and he starts to back up and retreat, the woman might team up with you in that moment to say, albeit ineffectively, right? Hey, we need to talk about this. Whereas if you're talking to a woman and trying to get to that level of, like, honesty and acknowledgement, the man might be like, you're on your own, man. I'm not going to jump in there and,
Yeah.
say more about this, because I don't, my default is retreat. So maybe those opportunities don't present themselves as much, maybe, but I think it's just really important to, like, open this up again in, like, an equitable an equitable way, searching, like you said, Mike, for understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is something that we just don't understand as well as we do the reverse, right? We've had more conversations about the reverse. We haven't had as many about this. They both exist, and they're both really important and really harmful. But more conversation about something doesn't mean you're putting it in a place of priority over another. It just means this is something we haven't talked about as much, and we need to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing in this is even if we say, hey, there's lots of places where this happens for men. I think it happens all the time to women too. And it's not so much like who's at fault here? Or it's like, oh, there's something to be understood in this thing that we don't fully understand yet. I think it's very complicated. That's why, one of the reasons I bring up these things from I think as a culture, we have this dynamic going on that we're kind of working against some inherent obstacles that we have to kind of work past those obstacles in order to help build a sense of self and sense of confidence in men so they can feel a little more ownership over their own experience and say, it's okay that I feel this way, but I'd like it to stop and I'd like to address this with you, or be able and willing to say, this isn't going to work for me. I need to get out of this thing because I can't make any changes here. But I do think it's a mistake when we say it has to be one side or the other. I think this happens and we need to be able to talk about it in a way that's let's see if we can understand why this happens and how we stop it.
Yeah.
So then I guess we just nailed it. I think we solved it in 45 minutes. So then come back next time and catch us on the Manspace. I want to push you around. Well, I will.